Den här meteoren filmades 1972. Om den träffat jorden så hade sprängkraften motsvarat 5 atombomber. Det var en sån här katastrof som utrotade dinosaurierna för 65 miljoner år sedan. Idag kunde vi klara oss genom att skjuta upp en raket med kärnvapen. Hotet från rymden. Ja, god afton och välkomna till Vetenskapens Värld igen. Ja, hotet från rymden, det har ju uppfattats olika genom tiderna. Länge så såg man ju himlafenomenen som tecken på kommande katastrofer och elände här på jorden. Senare så trodde vi att jordens atmosfär skulle skydda oss mot stenbumlingarna där ute i rymden. Men idag så vet vi att de är många och stora. Och vi vet också att de har träffat jorden många gånger och att de sannolikt kommer att göra det också i framtiden. Det finns miljoner så kallade asteroider i vårt solsystem och forskarna de blir allt mer intresserade utav dem.
I hate the thought of us behaving like ostriches and stuffing our heads in the ground pretending that there are no potential dangers around the corner. The reality is that these fireball increases will happen fairly suddenly when they happen. We have no means at the moment of predicting them. They may happen tomorrow, they may happen 100 years hence, who knows. The fact is we do not as a society, as a world society, have the means of handling this situation at the moment.
Den här meteoriten iaktogs häromåret hela vägen från Kanada till Texas. Ett naturens eget fyrverkeri med en liten knall på slutet.
Michelle Knapp's car is like a museum exhibit. Hundreds of people have been coming by since Friday to look at the hole in her trunk. What damaged her car was this rock. Already, she says she has had several calls from museums and collectors wanting to buy it and the trunk of her car.
Knappast något som orsakade panik, snarare en spännande nyhet för samlarna och ett inslag på de lokala nyheterna.
Mr. Brookout, what were you doing at the time?
I went out the back of our house, and I heard the bang.
Oh, they were so excited to think that it was a meteorite.
And we hope that members of the public will help us by looking for these.
I'm inclined to wish now that it dropped on somebody else's garden, not mine.
Could it actually have been anything else, like an unidentified flying object or a spacecraft?
That is an unanswerable question.
Tankarna på död och katastrofer som drabbar oss från skyn hör mest gångna tider till. Då vidskepliga människor var dödligt rädda för himlen.
They clearly saw the sky as interactive with the earth. And originally, the broad idea was that there were things impacting upon the earth. God hurled his thunderbolts at us, and there were catastrophes.
Det var en katastrofcentrerad världsbild. Himlen betraktades som en källa till underverk och eventuell undergång. Sen kom upplysningstiden och förändrade allting. Först kunde Isaac Newton förklara planeternas rörelser. Sen lyckades hans vän Edmund Halley förutsäga ankomsttiden för en komet som sen döptes efter honom.
the picture that emerged was clearly the one that Newton himself was picturing, where the solar system was seen as a giant clockwork machine. And the image was that this clockwork would function forever and forever.
Den nya vetenskapliga filosofin byggdes upp kring en helhetssyn och man hävdade att jorden var miljarder år gammal och att den måste ha bildats ofattbart långsamt.
This idea hadn't been truly accepted by perhaps the church and clerics, many of whom still thought that the biblical record implied catastrophe. The whole of this argument came to a head in the middle of the 19th century with an argument between Bishop Wilberforce and Huxley, which Huxley won. And this was essentially a victory for science over everything. And it was science with catastrophism written out of it.
Katastroferna förvisades från det vetenskapliga fältet till science fiction-området. Den här filmen spelades in år 1910 för att fira kometen Halley's återkomst.
A long time ago it was a flood in Noah's day that wiped out mankind. Now it will be a gigantic fireball.
The world will not end. Certainly these new bodies will pass our planet, but we are still here. Predicting the end of the world is an annual crackpot event in our society, an attempt to corner the newspaper headline.
De ofantliga nedslagen och katastroferna beskrivs ju i läroböckerna som en del av jordens tidiga historia. För över 4 miljarder år sedan, när solsystemet fortfarande höll på att bildas, kom hela svärmar av stora stenblock och slog ner på jorden. Men efter 1 miljard års bombardemang försvann de här jätteasteroiderna och lät jorden kretsa oantastad i rymden. Meteoriterna som vi ser nu för tiden är bara bleka skuggor av de här tidiga jättarna, men de bevisar att rymden mellan planeterna inte är helt tom.
There's a constant infall of extraterrestrial material. The bulk of this arrives as dust. Hundreds of thousands of tons of material actually falls each year. If that was all to arrive in one go, clearly that would be catastrophic. But this dust falls gently or drifts gently down onto the surface of the Earth. Only very occasionally larger objects, sufficiently large to survive passage through the Earth's atmosphere, land on the surface of the Earth as meteors.
Ett lätt regn av stoft och småsten som vår atmosfär skyddar oss emot. Som en sköld, det var en tilltalande och trygg bild som först nu börjar ifrågasättas på allvar. Forskarnas tvivel grundlades i början av 50-talet. Det var sanningen om en jättegrop i Arizona som blev allt för svår att blunda för.
Well, this crater was the first meteorite crater in the world that was shown to be a meteorite crater. So it was extremely important in that first intellectual step to recognize that, yes, indeed, very large objects do fall out of the sky and make holes in the ground.
Och för att hjälpa kollegorna att ta det här intellektuella steget behövdes vetenskapliga bevis.
One was to study the structure, the deformation on the walls of the crater, and how rocks have been pushed out and then peeled up and overturned. And I could compare that deformation directly with experimental craters, smaller craters formed by nuclear explosions.
Men geologiskt sett så var den här kratern väldigt ung. Skulle det kunna finnas större klippblock där ute bland gruset och stoftet? Arizona-kratern blev en berömd turistattraktion, men forskarna uppfattade den som en engångsföreteelse. Schumacher började undersöka var han kunde studera fler kratrar.
Maybe it looks obvious now that the craters on the moon were formed by impact, but in fact, the vast majority of scientists who studied the moon, astronomers in particular, at the time that I began this work, thought that these craters on the moon were probably formed by volcanoes. That had been the prevailing idea for a century before.
Månresorna bekräftade att ytan hade ett våldsamt förflutet som också kunde berätta om jordens inre.
The beauty of going to the moon is there's no rain, no atmosphere to speak of. And so a crater once formed lasts a very, very long time. So we have a perfect record going back 3 1/3 billion years in which we could say, here is the rate at which these things have been formed, and compare that directly to the Earth.
Han upptäckte att det fortfarande bildas stora kratrar med jämna mellanrum och alltså fanns det jättestenar där ute som ett hot mot jorden.
This is a problem that perhaps is of more interest to a geologist than to an astronomer. Indeed, the astronomers in the 20th century essentially abandoned the solar system. Their attention was turned to the stars and the galaxies, and very few were interested in the solar system, in the planets, or specifically in the Earth. The Earth and the Moon really ceased to be an object of inquiry for astronomers.
Vid 70-talets början intresserade sig Shoemaker för den till synes tomma himlen.
Our next step was to see what were the objects that made these craters. The only way to answer that is to go to the telescope and scan a large part of the sky and see what's coming by. This was the first time ever that anyone had attempted to go and systematically survey the space near the Earth for Earth-crossing bodies, asteroids and comets that could hit the Earth. At the time we started, only slightly more than a dozen of these things had ever been discovered in the entire course of astronomical observation.
Och orsaken var att stenarna var relativt små. Den svaga återspeglingen av solljuset kunde nätt och jämnt urskiljas på fotografierna mot stjärnbakgrunden.
This is in the constellation of Scorpio. Dr. Fry, notice the position of these new bodies.
Yes.
Now, just how fast they've been moving and their eventual destination are among the mathematical problems now being determined by our differential analyzer.
Men det rörde sig inte bara om småstenar. De här strecken markerar föremål stora som berg, miljoner ton tunga, och samtliga kunde träffa jorden. Dittills hade astronomerna undersökt galaxerna, men blundat för det som vi har precis framför ögonen. Man hade länge känt till rymdskräpet runt solen, men hade inte trott att det skulle komma i närheten av jorden.
Essentially, there are two catastrophic machines in the solar system which are directing missiles at us. One of them is the asteroid belt, which is regularly perturbed by Jupiter in its orbit close to the asteroid belt. And the other one is the so-called Oort cloud, which is perturbed by the galactic environment. Both these sets of perturbations result in asteroids or comets being deflected from their normal places into the center of the solar system, where they may be trapped through further interactions with the circulating planets. And it is the ones that are trapped that are potentially dangerous. We're a kind of target amongst all these bodies milling around which have come from places further out in the solar system.
Atmosfären skyddar inte jorden mot de stora bumlingarna. Ett föremål med 100 meters diameter slår ner på jorden med 20 kilometer i sekunden. En som insåg att de här stenarna kunde ställa till stor skada var nobelpristagaren Lou Alvarez. 1980 studerade han ett märkligt förhistoriskt händelseförlopp. För 65 miljoner år sedan försvann över hälften av jordens arter, bland andra dinosaurierna. Alvarez hade tankar om vad orsaken kunde ha varit och hans vision byggde sannoliken på ovanliga förlopp. Det var elegant tänkt, men det luktade katastrofteori och reaktionen var väntad.
I think it was almost universally negative. One can find a few who were not negative, and of course this number increases with hindsight. But no, I think to a first approximation, we all found it an appalling idea.
Men det fanns andra förklaringar till ödeläggelsen av jordklotet, till exempel klimatväxlingar eller ofantliga vulkanutbrott.
Paleontologists are accustomed to think in terms of long-term geologic processes affecting the evolution of life. And if you now suddenly tell them, well, occasionally a stone the size of a mountain falls out of the sky and produces a global catastrophe, they just don't like that. It's against their scientific religion, if you will.
We didn't know anything about what had been learned through the 60s and 70s about meteorite impact and the impact rates, because we had grown up with our textbooks which said that there indeed were bombarding asteroids and comets, but this was all in the early days, the so-called early bombardment of the Earth, and it was all over. And sure, Meteor Crater was probably an impact crater, but that's only one. It couldn't affect geologic history.
Men något hade dödat dinosaurierna och Alvarez teori fick forskarna att ta med en så att säga utomjordisk orsak i beräkningarna.
It's stimulated much new data, but more importantly, it has put paleontologists in communication with the rest of the scientific community. And so we're interacting with astronomers, with geophysicists, with geochemists. And this is wonderfully stimulating for both sides.
Om stenblock kunde orsaka en massutrotning så varför inte fler? Den geologiska dokumentationen verkar faktiskt tyda på att utrotningarna följde ett regelbundet mönster.
So we suggested that extinctions occurred in a clock-like way. That is, not all extinctions, but pulses of extinctions every 26 million years. This we published, and the astronomers, they're a rather gullible group, picked up on this and suggested a wonderful array of possible astronomical, solar system or galactic explanations.
Det fanns osynliga planeter, tvillingstjärnor, galaxmoln och jättekometer. Allt var bara teorier, men dinosauriernas dramatiska undergång var nu en accepterad katastrofteori. Samtidigt hade andra astronomer börjat jaga stenblock i den närmaste rymden. Det var tålamodsprövande att granska fotografier av natthimlen. När systemet datoriserades och fick elektroniska kameror blev det oändligt mycket känsligare för föremålens rörelser. Det gick också snabbare, men detta är bara en början.
In fact, we've only discovered maybe 5% of the total so far, and if we continue at our present rate, it will take us another 500 or 600 years before we discover 99% of them. However, the total number of astronomers involved in looking for Earth-threatening asteroids is in fact less than the staff of something like a high street McDonald's restaurant. Okay? That is the number of people worldwide that we're talking about looking for asteroids.
we know, for example, they're about 2,000 larger than a kilometer, a few 100,000 larger than 100 meters, and 150 million or so larger than 10 meters. But none of this was known just a few decades ago. We're in an age of discovery.
Steve Ostro lyckades pricka in en av de här gåtfulla stenarna med radioteleskop.
We've never seen an optical picture of any Earth-crossing asteroid. And this is a little bit ironic because we do have pictures of all other classes of major solar system body. The gaseous planets, the solid planets, their moons, ring systems, and main belt asteroids now. But we have no pictures of any Earth-crossing asteroids because we've never sent a spacecraft to any Earth-crossing asteroid.
Det här var den första avbildningen av våra närmaste följeslagare i rymden. De svaga radarsignalerna visade Castelia, ett enormt rullande klippblock. Två år senare fick han en bild av vår asteroidgranne Totartis. Äntligen började rymdbumlingarna röja sina hemligheter.
It's obviously undergone an extraordinary history of collisions for the past, at least 10 million years, several tens of millions of years. It's unlike any other object that we've ever seen. It's highly irregular. It has craters on it. It's jagged. It's in an unusual rotation state, so it's not just spinning around, but it's almost as if it's tumbling. And it's clear that there are a lot of questions about where this object got its unusual properties. Where did it come from? Imagine for a moment if, instead of these objects being tiny and not visible to the naked eye, they were suddenly made visible. Suppose that there was a button you could push and you could light up all the Earth-crossing asteroids larger than about 10 meters. There would be over 100 million of these objects in the sky, and you'd go outside at night, and instead of being able to see a few thousand bright stars, the sky would be filled with millions of these objects, all of which are capable of colliding with the Earth, and all of which are moving on slightly different courses through the sky at slightly different rates.
Men om vi nu är på drift genom såna här svärmar av stenar, varför syns det då inga ärr på jordytan?
Erosion takes its toll. Rain and wind and weathering of the rocks lead to the filling in of craters. Nature abhors craters. She fills them in on the surface rather quickly, so craters disappear. So what we had to look for was the deformation in the rocks, the wound in the earth, as it were, beneath the crater. And now we know how to recognize that. The crater doesn't hold its original shape. The walls collapse downward, the floor comes up. And what we've learned to recognize as an impact structure is a ring structural depression where the rocks have been depressed in a donut-shaped ring. And then there's an uplift in the center.
Geologerna har börjat hitta kratrar över hela världen, totalt cirka 200 stycken. Datasimulering och experiment i liten skala visar varför såren blir så djupa. Det handlar om megaton.
If we get to a really big event, say a 10-kilometer crater, which is still small compared to the biggest, that's equal to the energy of all of the nuclear weapons in the world. If you heap them up in a pile and set them off, 10,000 megatons makes a 10-kilometer crater.
Ett stenblock med 1 mils diameter skulle utlösa 1 miljard megaton. Det var den här sortens händelser som kunde ha gjort slut på dinosaurierna, men ingen hade hittat ärret i jordskorpan. Först på senare tid har geologerna upptäckt intressanta märken under Mexikanska golfen. De är numera helt osynliga på ytan, men om man undersöker berggrunden så avslöjas ett 65 miljoner år gammalt sår, en stor ringformig försänkning med nästan 20 mils diameter.
finding the big buried crater in Yucatan was a major step because we found the smoking gun. Really, we found the smoking cannon that produced the catastrophe at the end of the Cretaceous.
The environmental shock produced by a large comet or asteroid impact certainly is a good candidate because of simply, if nothing else, because of the energy levels. The debris which would go out from the impact point at ballistic velocities affect all hemispheres at essentially the same time. As to the particular scenarios, I don't think we know enough yet to know whether it was darkness or increase or decrease in temperature. What the killing mechanism actually was is still elusive. If the rocks falling out of the sky could produce one extinction pulse, then I think we must expect, if not assume, that other extinction pulses also have been caused by this mechanism. And as Shoemaker has delightfully pointed out, when we realize that rocks do fall out of the sky on a regular basis, this becomes acceptable in a gradualistic framework because it's part of the Earth's environment which we accept and understand.
Dinosaurierna måste ha haft en väldig otur, medan vi haft tur som levt under så trygg period.
If we're going to take the case of a global catastrophe, those only occur something like once every 100,000 years, maybe at the outside once every 200,000 years. So that's a very long time scale compared to the human lifetime. However, for these smaller objects, the maybe 100-meter fragments of asteroids which mostly blow up in the atmosphere but nevertheless cause widespread devastation underneath, those occur much more frequently. We certainly should be expecting at least one of those to occur over the next 50 or 100 years.
On the whole, people will accept it so long as the timescales between catastrophes are large. That is, for all intents and purposes, we can treat our present time as non-catastrophic. Now, this is really the crux issue. Can you have catastrophes on short time scales?
Den urgamla skräcken för himlen bygger kanske på erfarenheter. Det är svårt att veta om legendernas vagnar av eld var verkliga, men geologerna kan hjälpa oss.
In Australia we have a group of 13 craters that was formed by an impact of a large iron meteorite around about 5,000 years ago. Now we know that Aborigines were occupying Australia perhaps 40,000 years ago or more. And it's very likely indeed that they actually witnessed this impact event. And their local mythology speaks of a very strange event, and they have a local dialect name for these craters, and translated they talk about fire and devil rock, and all of these things tend to point to the fact that these ancient Aborigines actually witnessed the impact.
Medan det rådde medeltid i Europa fick möjligen slättindianerna på Argentinas Pampas uppleva något liknande. I nordväst såg de kanske hur en andra sol växte fram. Ett 200 meters klippblock hade precis trängt in i atmosfären i en mycket flack vinkel. En vägg av eldsflammor slog upp från nedslagspunkten och rullade fram i hundratals kilometer och brände allt som kom i dess väg. Spåren av den fruktansvärda händelsen upptäcktes för några år sedan av en argentinsk flygare. Han la märke till de här grunda droppformade försänkningarna på ytan av dagens Pampas. De bildades när asteroiden bröt sönder och studsade fram över jordytan. Den här amatörfilmen från 1972 visar en meteor som precis missade jorden. Vid en träff skulle den ha exploderat med samma kraft som 5 Hiroshima-bomber. Som tur var så snuddade den bara vid atmosfären. Nu har de här enorma skaderiskerna börjat oroa en del forskare som menar att de stora nedslagen visserligen är väldigt sällsynta, men att de kan döda miljoner människor när de väl inträffar. Ett föremål med bara 2 kilometers genomskärning kan döda en fjärdedel av jordens befolkning. Men den som går ut offentligt med sådana siffror möts av skepsis.
This is not a publicity-seeking campaign. We are completely aware that most of our colleagues ridicule our findings. But believing what we do, we have no choice but to ask for this hearing.
För några år sedan försökte en grupp forskare i Washington få USAs rymdutskott att upprätta en plan för hur man agerar vid ett nedslag. Gruppen hade tagit intryck av ett klippblock av ett hangarfartygs storlek hade passerat nära jorden ett år tidigare. Det upptäcktes först när det hade farit förbi.
Well, the position paper was very explicit in terms of identifying the potential threat, the frequency of such occurrences in the past. The last major impact was in 1908 in Siberia, and that left huge devastation, although it was not a populated area, but it destroyed forests over hundreds of miles there. And that actually was what we might call an airburst. It didn't actually hit the ground, but exploded before it hit the ground. So obviously it was a matter of some significance. It appears to the members of the committee that this is a reasonable way to demonstrate the utility and the value of systems that we've been funding for some period of time. That includes rocket systems, telescope systems, all of the things that enter into the space program and the military program.
Catch a falling star and put it in your pocket. Never let it fade away. Catch a falling star and...
Det fanns alltså goda politiska skäl att agera. Och utskottet beställde 2 utredningar från NASA. En om hur de här stenarna skulle upptäckas och en om hur man skulle kunna stoppa dem. Man blev snart oense om vilka stenar det skulle handla om, små eller stora. Ansvarig i Los Alamos för motåtgärdsrapporten blev Greg Canavan.
The small asteroid faction of the intercept group essentially got into an argument with the detection group. In fact, a fair number of people threatened to take their names off of the interception workshop report because the small asteroid interceptors did not need the large telescopes of the detection group. And so there was a competition between the two for whatever funds were available for the project.
USAs försvarsdepartement ingrep och publicerade dittills hemliga satellitdata om explosioner i rymden.
Before these asteroid interception workshops, they didn't see the value of that information and they simply threw it away. To a person, they wouldn't look precisely like an explosion, but a sensor, for instance, from a satellite, just sees a bright flash, and that final flash looks very much like a nuclear explosion.
I åratal hade militären studerat bombardemanget i den yttre atmosfären. Explosioner som sensorerna kunde misstolka som detonationer av kärnvapen. Men nu fanns det möjligheter till nya anslag och fantasin gick på högvarv.
Gentlemen, this is a rough design of our ship. Now, instead of taking off in the customary manner straight up, we will conserve fuel by using a mile-long slide to give us impetus.
För att knuffa klippblock i miljardtonklassen åt sidan i rymden föreslogs solreflektorer neutronbomber och elektromagnetiska katapulter.
Most of the ideas which I've heard put forward in terms of interception have been truly bizarre. All sorts of really science fiction type ideas, indeed totally fiction ideas, and they don't seem to be based upon the known laws of physics, many of them.
There were a number of them that were criticized as too futuristic, but we tried to include them all in the report because we're talking about a problem that's probably going to have to be worked on a time scale of decades or centuries. And over that sort of a time scale, I think that it's inappropriate to try to screen what fields are going to develop and what fields are not going to develop. I think I would be exhibiting hubris to say that I can pick now the winners and losers in that technological race.
Arbetet med rapporten hämmades av konflikter, men så kom kometen Swift-Tuttle. Den missade jorden med miljontals kilometer, men den skulle återkomma år 2126.
There was an enormous panic when that warning went out. There was real concern that in 100 years Swift-Tuttle would come back and smack right into the earth.
Nya beräkningar visade att detta var fel, men under tiden så blev utredningen klar. Ett frågetecken var kvar. Fanns det någon organisation som ville driva ett sånt här projekt?
There was a president of America who saw Wicked Empire, and for the purposes of dealing with this wicked empire, he set up an organization called the SDI, a Star Wars organization.
Daddy, what this Star Wars stuff is all about. He said that right now we can't protect ourselves from nuclear weapons.
Whether or not the Star Wars organization succeeded in doing what it wanted to do, the mere fact of its existence, or potential existence, was enough, apparently, to bring the Cold War to a grinding halt. This has created a situation where the SDI no longer needs to exist. And I suspect this has been somewhat of an embarrassment to the SDI. And inevitably they were bound to look for a way of preserving themselves.
Well, I'm not sure I ought to comment on that. I think the Ballistic Missile Defense Office is probably in a declining mode, but if there is any one office that has the technical capabilities to participate in this program, it would be that office. And I would be delighted to assign that responsibility to them.
Men de gamla motsättningarna kvarstår. Visserligen anser många att det är väl använda pengar att studera asteroiderna. Däremot så måste man ju inte skjuta prick på dem.
The asteroid collision hazard is a tiny little risk compared to the risk to civilization, the risk to the species that we confront overall. There's the population explosion. There's the possibility of eco-catastrophe, global warming, poisoning of the biosphere. We're facing in the next century much more serious risks than asteroids colliding with the Earth.
It looks like previous species have, at intervals of some tens or hundreds of millions of years, have been wiped out by such impacts. They didn't have the opportunity or the means to do anything to prevent such impacts. We do. It's analogous to the hazard of fire to your house. We are currently without fire insurance, and worse than that, we're locked in our house.
Satelliten Clementine kommer att passera asteroiden Geographus och därmed möta en av jordens asteroidgrannar. Motivet är rent militärt.
It's to test a whole series of very small, beautiful, lightweight cameras that were designed for detecting missiles. And this is a test flight for those cameras. Now, the science is coming as a gift. It's free, virtually. So so it's a great thing for us.
Data från Geographus kommer att avgöra om man vill investera i ett globalt skydd. Under tiden planerar man intimare kontakter med asteroider.
then the next step would be to have hard landings on the asteroids. That is, simply crash into them and see how much blow-off was produced, how much material was expelled, and how large of a recoil was produced, and measure directly how much fragmentation there was of the asteroid.
Well, if we have a standing asteroid deflection capability, then maybe someday people will start trying to deflect objects that are non-threatening into collision course with the Earth. This is intrinsically an extraordinarily dangerous technology. Moving a several kilometer object into collision course with the Earth would be equivalent to engineering a Cretaceous tertiary extinction, a mass extinction. If it's such a dangerous technology and it would be extremely expensive, why in the world would we as a civilization want to do this unless there were a crying need to do it? It just makes no sense.
Det enda sättet att överblicka riskerna, det är att spåra upp stenblocken. NASA har nu startat ett $150 miljoner projekt som ska placera en satellit i omloppsbana kring jätteasteroiden Eros. Det här är en känslig manöver med tanke på hur svårt det är att förutsäga exakt var de här föremålen befinner sig. De gamla beräkningarna stämmer inte längre. Det har visat sig att de här föremålens banor inte är lika förutsägbara som man har trott. När de väl har upptäckts så måste astronomerna hålla ögonen på dem, annars så vet man inte var de hamnar och om de kommer att träffa jorden eller inte.
Och det här reportaget hade gjorts för BBC:s Horizon. Och från rymden så ska vi nu förpassa oss ner till jorden igen, där civilisationerna kommer och går alldeles oavsett himlafenomenen. Folket som skapade mayakulturen i Centralamerika har alltid fascinerat eftervärlden. Många har försökt tolka och beskriva den här märkliga kulturen. Men av allt att döma så har vår bild av mayafolket hittills inte varit alldeles korrekt. Nya utgrävningar har gjorts under senare år. Om dem så berättar nu Hans Viljus.
Den amerikanske forskningsresanden och diplomaten John Lloyd Stevens högg sig år 1839 fram genom Honduras täta bergsdjungler. Lockad av rykten om en fantastiskt försvunnen stad. Det skulle finnas en stor mayastad full av monument och skulpturer. Byggd och övergiven långt innan den vite mannen landsteg i nya världen. Men inte ens efter de otroliga historier Stevens hade hört var han förberedd på den spöklika syn han mötte. Den låg framför oss som en sönderbruten bark mitt ute på havet. Masterna var borta, besättningen försvunnen. Allt var ett mysterium, mörkt och outgrundligt. Vad var det för ett sofistikerat folk som hade byggt den eleganta stad som låg framför honom, nästan intakt? Vart hade det försvunnit? Det mest förbryllande var de säregna skulpturerna och utsmyckningarna som prydde templen. Var det något slags språk? Men här, liksom i andra maya-ruiner, förblev mysteriet olöst. Man lyckades inte tolka språket och inte förklara pyramiderna. De frustrerade vetenskapsmännen hängav sig åt fantasier och tecknade en bild av mayafolket som ett fredligt, kontemplativt folk som blomstrade under visa astronomers och prästers vakande ögon.
When I walked among its temples, I did not see a pile of stone, but I thought, Washaklahun Ubak Awil built this. He dedicated that ball court. And I began to understand all of those works, not as the relics of a dead civilization, but as the fossils of the human beings, the minds of the people who had created them. Copan came alive.
När Linda Schiele kom till Centralamerikas djungler i slutet av 60-talet var mayaforskningen ännu outvecklad. Mayafolket hade tämjt regnskogen, odlat majs, kakaobönor och kaffe, ungefär som deras ättlingar gör idag. De byggde stora städer i Tikal, Gachilan, Chichen Itza och Palenque. De handlade med stenar som jade, skapade en del av de finaste skulpturerna i nya världen och byggde pyramider som kunde tävla med faraonernas. Men det fanns mycket mer att upptäcka. Vetenskapsmännen hade hängivit sig åt ett önsketänkande som sa mer om deras egen tid än om mayafolkets.
From the period of the 1930s up through the 60s, the great scholars of the time, Morley, Thompson, and others, characterized Maya society as having basically two groups of people, a whole bunch of peasant farmers who supported a very tiny elite who spent their lives contemplating the stars and time and living in ceremonial centers that were filled once or twice a year during great ritual festivals. The picture that was drawn of the Maya is that they never had war, they never disagreed with each other, and one wonders how they got close enough to each other even to reproduce themselves through the common human means.
People clung to that idea tenaciously, and I think part of the reason for that is they were reacting to all of the excesses and the maladies of Western culture. You have to remember that their context was that of two world wars, where literally the whole world was involved in a deadly conflict.
They wanted a peaceful people. They wanted to know that someplace in the world there was a human community that lived without war and competition.
I 15 år har arkeologen Bill Fash och hans kollegor utvecklat utgrävningsmetoder som gör det möjligt att rekonstruera monumenten medan de gräver ut dem. Förut hade arkeologerna inget annat val än att riva de stora monumenten skikt för skikt för att komma åt äldre byggnadsverk under dem. Men i Copan har arkeologerna byggt en labyrint av tunnlar genom ruinerna och undvikit att skada dem.
Since the building of the Acropolis was a matter of layers upon layers upon layers, or as some have commented, it's like boxes inside of boxes, the easiest way to get from one to the next is by the tunneling. The world of the tunnels is like three-dimensional. It's very different because you can go up, down, or sideways. You can move in every direction.
If we had to do a traditional archaeological excavation of the Copan Acropolis, we'd have to destroy half of everything we dug. But with tunneling, we're able to just do surgical strikes. It's as if we're doing arthroscopic surgery, and we can just go in there with just very small excavations to exactly the point we want and get a maximum of information for a minimum of disturbance to the archaeological site. The tunneling's been vital to understanding the history of ancient Copan. We have the hieroglyphs that tell us about the kings, but the tunneling tells us about the buildings that were constructed by each of these rulers.
Här låg rika män, kanske kungar. Men vilka de var vet vi inte. Om det finns några ledtrådar finns de antagligen på väggarna i hieroglyferna som så länge bevarat sina hemligheter. Men de senaste åren har språket vaknat till liv. För första gången på 1000 år kan mayaspråket höras bland ruinerna. Och det säger ger oss en helt annan bild av det folk som skrev på väggarna.
We went from talking about empty ceremonial centers which held only priests basically and people living in little hamlets on the outsides who would come in on Sunday to peddle their corn, you know, to some large urban centers, to understanding the fact that these cities like Copan was over 20,000 people living with the same kind of pollution that we get today in our cities. We now understand that the Maya were really much more like everybody else's. They're much more human.
När koden knäcktes försvann bilden av folket som fredliga stjärnskådare. Copans kungar ledde sitt folk i blodiga strider mot grannarna. Hieroglyferna berättar om och om igen om människooffer och självstympning. För mayafolket var det en garanti för deras kosmos fortlevnad.
The most sacred substance was human blood, especially a king's blood. Led in auto-sacrificial ritual was the greatest gift that a king could offer to the gods and to his ancestors. There are a number of sites where child sacrifices have been found. It was thought that the baby's tears would bring the rainwater from the sky. So a lot of sacrifice was oriented toward fertility, toward ensuring that the natural cycles took their course and that the harvest would be bounteous and the people would be happy.
There are two great acts that kings consistently presented in the public forum. One is the taking of captives. The other is the taking and the offering of the king's own blood in ritual sacrifice taken from the most sacred areas of his own body. For a male, the genitals. For the female and the male, it's the tongue. It's the place where human beings reproduce themselves and the place where speech is made, where meaning is communicated from one person to another. Bloodletting was the central act of piety. Now why? One kind of soul is called chulel. It is a sacred living substance that is in our bodies that is never destroyed. It's passed on from you to future generations. That kind of soul resides in human blood. So that when kings give victims of war in sacrifice, or when they take blood from themselves, they are all giving the most potent and the most important, valuable substance on the face of the earth. Our culture says the same thing. What do we say? Greater love hath no man than he give his life for his brother.
Blodsoffer förekom vid alla högtider och riter i mayafolkets liv. När barn föddes, tempel invigdes, strider förbereddes och segrar firades. Också idrotten fick en mystisk innebörd. På Copins storslagna bollplan